Welcome to the third lecture of 4 in the Rational Spirituality Crash Course. Are we trapped in the Matrix? Obviously not literally saying, are we trapped in the Matrix? I'm using it as an allegory, just so you know. So, rational spirituality, the idea that we can sort of figure out the essence of what we are and what's going on, the mystery of consciousness, without having to take anything on faith or believe anything without evidence. Where we are in the course. So, this is a course, this is a third of 4, and everything is meant to fit together in the course. It's a gradual progression of ideas that lead us to the final lecture. So if you feel lost at any point, you might need to look at the ones previous. So previously, we covered unifying science and consciousness. We understand that science is an exceptionally powerful tool and process, and in the story of science is incredibly important to us. But the story of consciousness is also, kind of important to us. Consciousness is the thing that makes the universe something that can be experienced, as opposed to an abstract idea that no one knows about. So, can we unify those two things? Can we bring the problems that we have with these two stories, can we resolve them? Can we bring those two stories together in a coherent way? That's what we try and do in the first lecture. At least the start of it. So in the second lecture, the demonstrable power of free will, it's the title gives it away somewhat. We look at how free will is defined. There are 3 different definitions of free will. That's amusing. And that's what I can sort of get from the exploration that I've done on the issue. And obviously it's something that I'm quite interested and quite passionate about. That's why I'm doing a course on it, or a course covering it. So we have the case against free will that we must understand, because we will hear it, and we need to know how to respond to it. And also we need to have an appreciation of the intellectual opposition to the idea that free will is a thing. And we finish off quite nicely with proof, a demonstration that free will must exist. Now, we're in the third lecture. Are we trapped in the Matrix? Well, we'll be looking at the notion of being born into a prison. That we've got people around us fighting to protect the system. And that we should free our minds. Or you should free your mind. I mean, maybe you already have. How do I know? Later, we'll be looking at exceptional conscious experiences as the 4th and final lecture in the course. Born into a prison. So this idea is as old as the hills. Okay, well, it's as old as the hills if the hills are as old as ancient Greece. 380 to 360 BC, we have Plato's cave. Plato had the idea that there could be people who were born and spent their entire lives in a cave, restrained so they could only see the wall in front of them. Behind them, there was a gantry where people could walk by, and further back than that, there was a fire, so people walked behind them. They couldn't see the people directly, but they could see the shadows cast onto the cave in front of them. And that was their lives for them. That was everything that they knew. Plato asks us to consider the notion that we could free one of these prisoners and show them the world as it actually is, that they would see untold colour and light, and they would experience a world that was radically different from the one that they knew. That if they then went back and tried to tell the other prisoners about it, that they wouldn't be able to make sense of what they were saying, that there is a greater reality that we can see, but we can't be told about it. We have to see it for ourselves. well, when we get to The Matrix in 1999, this idea's come back. It's a similar notion to Plato's cave, but a high-technology vision with a hero's journey for Neo and more guns and kung fu than I can reasonably imagine that Plato would have considered, especially because I don't think there were guns in ancient Greece. Invisible prisons. What constrains our freedom? If you think of a prison, it seems fairly obvious. It's the building, it's the bars, it's the handcuffs, the locks, the shackles. This is what constrains our freedom. But is it? Is it really? Is it the physical that constrains one's freedom? Now you might say, well, that's a very stupid point to make, Matthew. I mean, it starts to sound a bit dodgy here, but if you were to put me in handcuffs for any particular reason, then you argue as much as you like that the handcuffs aren't restraining you. I think it would be obvious they were. But that's not my point. My point is it's not like the handcuffs just sort of jump onto people and just before you know it, you're just walking down the street, minding your own business, pair of handcuffs from a hedge, just jumps onto your arms. It doesn't work like that. They're not agents. Physical constraints don't have agency to impose their will upon you. It doesn't work like that. Is the physical a limitation at all, or the gift of structure? This is an interesting one, right? Let's paint a picture. Would random noise make for good music? Could you have a symphony that wasn't contingent, dependent on structure, on creating patterns and breaking patterns, playing with your expectations, creating a sense of aesthetic? Where does that come from, if not rules? So is the physical a limitation? Well, maybe a good way of thinking about this would be if there was no physical world and everything was just a world of abstract mind where you could sort of fluidly conjure up anything that you wanted and it wouldn't persist. When your thoughts changed, it would change. Is that going to make a good basis for a form of adventure or entertainment or exploration? Is it going to offer you anything? And it sort of comes back to this point of, is the physical a limitation or the gift of structure? What about flight? At some point, someone said, because of what humans are, there's no way we're going to be able to fly. It's not like we can just grow wings like a bird has and fly off into the heavens. So it may seem like the physical has imposed a limitation on us. But has it imposed a limitation on us, or did it just issue us with a challenge? Obviously, we've come up with aeroplanes since then, or airplanes if you're in the US, and we've got paragliders and gliders and jetpacks and all sorts of incredible ways which we have given ourselves the gift of flight for our ingenuity. So I'm going to put it to you, the physical is actually more of a tool than it is anything else. It can be used and abused, it can be used for good and it can be used for bad. It's something that you can use to explore what it is to exist. It's not something that limits you. The physical doesn't limit you, it gives you opportunities. So what does enforce constraints? Well, what about conscious constraints? What about constraints that come from another living being, another source of agency? So, if we look at that prison once again, we've got an interesting situation, because while we initially might have thought that a prison constrains you by virtue of the cells and the bars, in actual fact, the reason that you go to prison isn't because it just happened to you. It's because you made conscious decisions Or perhaps, if we're to be the most charitable to the most extreme cases, you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Regardless of what exactly it was that got you there, there was a conscious process involved. People with agency constrained you. It wasn't the physical world deciding to do it. It's consciousness, and nothing but consciousness, that imposes constraints on consciousness. That's what I'm trying to say. And I understand that people will say, well, no, Matthew, there are things that we can't do because we're physical. But if you take the physical away, then you take what it is to be human. And what do you have left to make sense of that? How do you have a meaningful comparison? The only way that I could agree with the notion that the physical is imposing constraints on us is if we removed the physical, that we'd be more free, that we'd have greater potential without being embodied. And I just simply don't agree with that as an idea. Which leads me to something of a conclusion that the only thing that constrains us is consciousness, and that the only thing that really constrains consciousness is believing things that limit our freedom, believing things that limit what we can do. Essentially, false beliefs, limiting beliefs, are those which stop us from achieving our potential. If we want a limiting prison, if we want an invisible prison, it's shaped out of limiting beliefs. Fighting to protect the system. We believe what we're taught. So, there is religious doctrination, even if we are the most charitable we can possibly be to religion. Let's say, for the sake of a good argument and a fair exchange, that religion comes from a place of truth. Let's imagine that's true. Let's imagine that that's actually the case. Well, if that were actually the case, then because there's such a lot of disagreement between different religions, we'd have to appreciate or accept the notion that if there is a truth behind religion, that there's a lot of confusion about what that truth is. That other people have added to it and edited it and used it and abused it for their own ends and means. That if there were, or if there are, and have been, prophets who've had some sort of connection with a divine force, like Jesus or Muhammad or Buddha. I'm sorry if I didn't mention your particular prophet, but you get the idea that if they are connected to something greater than themselves, that tells us that we need to love each other and forgive each other and generally be decent human beings, that even if that's true, that the religions that form from it, that come up with doctrines, they don't all agree with each other, so they can't all be completely correct. And it would make sense that they're from old traditions that need updating. It would make sense that people, unfortunately, are going to use this and manipulate it for their own ends and power. So even if religion comes from the best possible place, and it really has a fundamental truth lying behind it, we still have religious harm and indoctrination. So we might find this distasteful, it might upset us, we might really dislike the idea that we will accept beliefs that are harmful to us, that point us in the wrong direction, that it's sort of in the water and that it's just going to happen, that we're going to get taught stuff that's rubbish. How do we respond to that? We might try and take a first principles reasoning approach. We might try and say, okay, well, a lot of people have thought this. Let's try and challenge it. Let's try and think critically. Let's try and... But you really do have to get to the start of the reasoning process, the first principles by which things work, in order to really do that effectively. So, if that's so great, why don't we do it all the time? Why aren't we constantly working everything through from first principles? And the reason that we don't is because it's so damn expensive. The time, the effort, the energy of trying to rediscover and verify everything all over again is too much for people. You can only hope to apply this particular technique in rare cases to small areas of knowledge, and it will take you a long time to do it at that. Let's consider, to illustrate this point, a desert island thought experiment. Let's say that you get stuck on a desert island. I'm sorry about that, but it is a thought experiment if it makes you feel better. You're stuck on a desert island. Maybe there's a few people with you. And we'll forget about the fact that there's probably not enough of you for a sustainable genetic pool that will mean that a population survives on the island for a long time. But let's sweep that under the carpet for now and say that you might actually be able to start up a little corner of humanity on this island. And so we actually have to think about the future. How long is it going to be before you start smelting metals, right? What about when you have... How long is it going to take you to get to the point where you can start doing electromagnetism in experiments and just checking things? And how long is it going to take you to start writing libraries again? How much of the knowledge that you came to the island with is going to get lost, and how much are you going to have to reset your civilization back? It should start to be obvious to you as you think about this that we're really, really interdependent. Humans need each other all the time. We rely on each other all the time. And this is something that I think that people forget. One of the things that sticks out in my mind is how much hard disk technology is improved and how it's evolved, and how that the next stages of evolution of this particular technology demand more and more money, and it ends up concentrating the production of these new devices into a smaller and smaller area in the global market. There are just a few players doing this now. And it's because you couldn't just go out and compete with these guys. You can't just start it off. You just wouldn't have the resources or the knowledge and the know-how and the tools to do it. We need each other all over the planet. As we grow and as we get more sophisticated, there are things which we can't do as individual nations. I mean, you could try pushing things in that direction, but it's got to be more economically viable and efficient to try and cooperate mutually. So this is where it gets really interesting as well. It's a bit like advertising. You might think you're an exception to this. You might think, well, yeah, I can see people definitely take on beliefs that are absolute rubbish. It happens all around me. And you might think it's like advertising. Other people get entranced and persuaded and influenced by advertising. But those adverts don't work on you. People think that they might be an exception to believing rubbish. Do you see where I'm going with this? You're probably not. I'm probably not. There's probably a few things that I believe that are rubbish. I do try very hard to have conversations with people and figure out what those might be. Have you reviewed the evidence for the Big Bang? Personally? Have you gone out and checked the papers, checked the math, checked all the principles behind it? You know, have you looked at this for yourself with a critical eye? Have you taken in all the evidence and the history and figured everything out, tried to make sure there's nothing that's missing? Or do you have faith in the scientific consensus? I mean, even if you didn't have faith in the scientific consensus, how long would it take you to actually review all that stuff and to get the expertise for it? How much money and time and how many years of your life would it cost you just to simply verify something that you're expecting to be correct anyway? It seems like a lot of us have to have faith in the scientific consensus, that people have done stuff right, that people have followed the principles of science and the virtuous process of it correctly, that there's been integrity and the sufficient amount of integrity that we wouldn't have made any terrible mistakes. And it's an odd one. When I was doing A-level biology, an article came out in New Scientist saying that we grew new brain cells. And this was a shock to people because we really thought that we didn't. And when I said this to my biology teacher at the time, she found it was fascinating, but she said, well, just for the exam, don't forget, for the exam, we don't, okay? And we had a little bit of a laugh about that. There's something really disturbing here to me. You see, the way that we're told how science works, we would assume that we wouldn't have made an assumption that we didn't grow new brain cells unless it had actually been demonstrated and proven and gone through some sort of scientific review. But this is obviously a piece of dogma that definitely made it through. And that's disturbing, because that tells me, from my personal experience, and maybe you've got something like it similar for yourself, that while science is bloody marvellous, and I'm not suggesting that there's an alternative solution or it's something better than the scientific process. I'm not suggesting that. I love it. I think we should stick with it. But we have to remind ourselves that it's not flawless. That scientific communities can believe bullshit, and we're not even quite sure how it happened. There has been disturbing ideas that a lot of psychology may have serious repeatability problems. It's really worrying. And if that wasn't enough, another thing that I got taught when I was at school was that margarine was way better for you than butter. It turns out the margarine that you would have bought at the time was full of trans fats. Oh my God, it's like a car crash. So you can't abandon what works, but you have to appreciate that it's not perfect. Out-sheeping the sheep. What the hell do I mean by that? Well, we often have this as a slur, the idea that there are lots of sheeple, people who just follow what's going on around them. They tune into what they like, what feels right to them, and they follow, like sheep. And the point's made that sheep need sheepdogs to keep them in order. People out-sheep sheep because they keep each other in order. And this is a sense very much key to the idea of fighting to protect the system. People will try and protect the system that's around them. They'll try and protect the belief systems that they and their communities have. So I want to give you an example of how this sort of psychology plays out. And I want to do it by sort of talking about the reaction that I had when I was going through a smart motorway, which is essentially one of those motorways where there's cameras everywhere. So presumably at some point down the line, maybe in 20 years' time, there'll be a despotic regime in the UK and it will just all turn completely to mess because there's all these cameras out there just monitoring what everybody does. I mean, if ever anyone gets into power, just a tiny little bit like Hitler, we're all so screwed because we're building up this surveillance state. But in the meantime, motorway roadworks and speeding. Let's tackle this. So there's a smart motorway, and they're reducing the speed because there's some roadworks that are going on. So we all slow down for the speed limit. Most of the people around slow down for the speed limit. And then there's just, it's that situation where there's one guy, he thinks the rule doesn't apply to them, and they just come whizzing past in the fast lane, and everyone's just, oh my goodness me, we all want to speed, damn it. None of us want to slow down, but we're doing it for some reason. We're doing it because we've been told to. Now, maybe there was a good reason behind that. Maybe there are people who are genuinely, at risk doing the roadworks. But what if they're not? What if they've gone home? Obviously, it's still a riskier driving condition, but it's not quite the same. It's not like the speed limits go up when the road workers go home. You know, they stay at the same speed limit as when the workers are there, which doesn't entirely make sense to me. But in any case, we all get very annoyed when we see a rule breaker when we're obeying the rules. And when I then saw the two flashes half a second apart, there was a lot of schadenfreude going on, I'll tell you that. And it's sad in a way, but in that moment, I was really happy that that person who decided that they weren't going to follow the rules had been caught out. I've got mixed feelings about that right now. It's a very complex issue. And let's not get too sidetracked on it. Why enforce conformity? When people decide to conform, they desire conformity from others. I think that's probably what we just hit on with the example that I've just given you. But maybe it's not enough. Let's give you another example. If you're making a real effort to social distance during the pandemic and you see other people not, you get angry. You've decided that these rules are right and you want other people to follow them too. Maybe you've come at that from the different point of view as well. Maybe you don't believe what we're being told. And maybe it just seems like we're all just imposing rules arbitrarily on you. Or we're being gullible. We've all got our own opinions as to what works best. Hopefully by the end of that, though, it's become quite obvious that we will fight to protect the system. Free your mind. The red pill. So the red pill is a cultural metaphor of the choice of a harsh or unexpected truth. And obviously, with it being choice, the alternative is the blue pill. It's to believe whatever you want to believe, whatever makes you happy, whatever you want. Just, it's not the truth. Red pills are personal and emotional journeys, like my tantric experience. So, while I recognise that there's a lot of rules that are in place for the good of all of us, and I'm okay with that, I accept that and I appreciate that, and there might be some wiggle room and things that we need to revise or evolve, change or update, let's set that aside for now. So I don't want you to take my word for it that I had a tantric experience. I don't want my personal testimony of something that's happened to me to be all the evidence you need that this is a real phenomenon by itself. If you've had this experience for yourself, then that would make a lot of sense that you'd believe me coming out with it. But if you haven't, the idea that there should be something that's called a tantric experience that might lie outside of our accepted and understood and conventional wisdom and scientific understanding is somewhat like I just came into the room and said, I can do magic. What, stage magic? No, real magic. I mean, that's a sort of statement that invites a rejection. It invites incredulity. It invites us to go, yeah, all right, mate, sure. So that tells you something. It tells you that we don't believe that things like this are really true. Not really. Now, that's why it was a red pill for me. So I'm just going to very, very, very briefly talk about the experience, but really I'll be coming back to it in the next lecture to sort of draw it out a bit more. So I'll only just give you the quickest of outlines right now. I had not a wishy-washy, but a real experience in the sense that, you know when you're hungry, you know when you've stubbed your toe, You know when you've hurt yourself. It's not ambiguous. It's not like guesswork. You're not like, have you stubbed your toe? Ooh, I think I've stubbed my toe. It doesn't work like that. You're not unsure whether you've stubbed your toe. You have or you haven't. So that's what I mean by that. This was an experience that wasn't, was that a bit weird? It was very clear and obvious. There was nothing vague about it in the slightest. It was repeatable within the situation that I was in. There were no other reasonable explanations for what had happened. As far as I was concerned, this was the thing that made me take a step back, because I came from this, I did all the sciences at A-level, and I was going to become a scientist until I became a software developer instead. And the reason was I just couldn't quite picture what I wanted to do in science, but I loved computers. And that's where we hit the problem. You see, there's nothing in science that we're aware of that would allow for what happened that day. So we're off the map. And for a lot of people, what that means is I made it up, or I imagined it, or I'm going crazy. Pick your poison. But for me, from my perspective, what I experienced was something that made me realise that I was naive and wrong, because I thought that if something like Tantra were real, that we'd be reading about it in science textbooks, that there'd be a clear mechanism for it, that it would be something that was just acknowledged and understood and talked about and real, and that we could figure it out somehow, that it would be obvious, that people would just know, that there wouldn't be something that's quite so profound, just tucked away, hidden from popular culture, not acknowledged as being a real thing. It just seemed crazy to me. But there I was, confronting it. So you don't have to believe that it's a real thing. You just have to believe that I believe that it's a real thing. And as soon as that's true, that's my red pill. That's the moment where I look at all the physics and chemistry and biology and all the passion that I had for that, and the way that I used to go and just love talking about this stuff, and just take a step back and go, I was arrogant. I thought I knew it all. At least the broad brushstrokes. And I really didn't. So this is deeply disruptive to existing beliefs. If you believe something and it comes tumbling down, you start questioning all the other things you believe too. There's a domino effect, there's a knock-on effect. And I think that we're seeing this, not just Tantra, but I think there are various things in the way that things are unfolding in the current time ghost or zeitgeist. I sounds like a fancy word, but it's the spirit of now, right? It's where we are in civilization and the story as it unfolds in our culture. This idea of people becoming disillusioned with their belief systems and seeing evidence that contradicts them is going on all around us. Which brings us to letting go of limiting beliefs. Our limiting beliefs are often personal struggles. I'll give you an example. Was the failure of my last relationship something that happened to me and the world is cruel? Or was it something I did to myself? I mean, that's an interesting one. It's if I choose to believe that it was outside of my control, then I'm powerless to change it. But if it's something that I did that was just stupid, if it's something where I'm the person who's responsible, that's great, because I can change that. There's a possible laundry list of self-limiting beliefs. So rather than trying to go through a list that would take us years to even really get through, let's just go straight to the source. Let's go to the top idea. Let's go to the principal idea that I would say that all limiting self-beliefs come from. Who or what is in charge of your life? There's one narrative that says physics makes things happen. We covered this in the first lecture. Physics certainly does seem to make things happen. Well, physics is more of a description of what happens rather than saying that it does happen, but because the mathematical relationships are so constant, we can say that whatever's driving them is constant, and whatever that is, whatever makes physics tick, is what makes things happen. And we can sort of express that, although it's a bit of a fudge, of saying that physics makes things happen. It looks a lot like it. It looks a lot like physics drives everything. And then we have a problem. As we've encountered in the last 2 lectures now, consciousness makes things happen. It's really the demonstrable power of free will more than anything else, where we have already demonstrated it. Demonstrably and provably. In a nutshell, you should see the second one if you're not sure about what I'm saying here. If consciousness has the ability to talk about itself in the physical world, it has to be pretty bloody causal to do that. If consciousness wasn't causal, if consciousness wasn't in charge in any way, shape or form, it wouldn't be able to talk about itself and self-express through the physical world. And it's the modern dogma, and I really want to use harsher swear words right now, but it's the modern nonsense of our times that consciousness doesn't affect reality. It's the biggest load of claptrap that I can think of. It's evident that it does, and if it didn't affect the world, then responsibility, reward and blame would all be meaningless anyway. I mean, it doesn't make sense. It's nonsense. The idea that consciousness doesn't make things happen is bloody nonsense. And it's, unfortunately, very popular nonsense. And it saddens me no end, because I do believe in science. And I don't think that believing in science means that we have to just stick our fingers in our ears and go, physics is in charge, physics is in charge, physics is in charge. It's not like that. We should be trying to make sense of our observations, not take what we think we understand and impose it on the world. All right. I'm going to calm down a bit now. And there's another point that we need to consider. If consciousness made physics happen, so if consciousness is responsible for the behaviour that we see in physics, physics ceases to be causal and instead just becomes a tool of consciousness. That's an interesting one to think about, isn't it? So we've got a potential objection to this, of course. Physics makes things happen, but consciousness does not, which is kind of what I've already just talked to. Let's say I'm wrong. Let's say I'm completely and utterly wrong, and consciousness doesn't shape the world. Let's say that physics is completely in charge. Well, if that's true, I don't care. If I don't have the ability to shape my own future, I don't care. Why don't I care? Because there's no point in caring. I can't do anything about it. If I'm going to just be a helpless passenger, and it doesn't sound like it from the way that I'm talking, but if I'm just going to be a helpless passenger in my life, f*** it all. What does it matter? It doesn't matter how much chaos I cause in the world by talking about the idea that I'm actually in charge if I'm not in charge, and if I am in charge, it's a bloody good thing to be telling other people that they are too. But if I'm not, if I'm wrong, it's consequenceless. Now you can say, well, it does have a consequence. It's terrible that you're telling people that they have free will when in fact they don't. Well, it's not like I could have done otherwise, is it? Things that are your responsibility. This one's really important. Pay attention. If you don't program your own mind, other people will do it for you. Free thinking and critical thinking are your tools for avoiding dogma. This is heavy, I get it, right? But if you're going to allow other people to influence your mind, if you're going to... Well, there's only one thing that I could reasonably disagree with you on, right? If there was one thing that I would disagree with you on more than anything else, it's if you came and told me that I don't have the power of self-determination. We've already covered that, you know, from the... we've just gone over this. But you could watch Sam Harris and you could say, well, he's a smart guy. He's got a New York Times bestseller. He's a clever man. A lot of people agree with him. It feels like what he's saying feels right to me. And he's been right about this, that, and the other. So I guess he must be right about free will. Is that free thinking and critical thinking? Are you using those tools to avoid that dogma? Or are you just turning into a bit of a sheeple? Sorry, terrible phrase. I shouldn't say that. No, I'm just making a point though, right? Are you going to think critically and freely? Are you going to program your own mind? Or are you going to let someone convince you that you've got no power? Like, out of all the things that people can convince you, convincing you have no power sounds like quite a crippling, terrible thing to do to anybody. Moving on, things that are other people's responsibility. When others wrong you, they're responsible for that. But you're responsible for how you respond. This is so important. This is so important. I've done so badly on this in my life. I have. When the emotions get strong enough, I will blame other people for the bad situations I end up in, like I'm the victim of their behaviour, like that they're still living in my head rent free. I love that phrase. It's great. And I'm just harming myself. The way that I respond to people is up to me. They're responsible for what they've done that's wrong to me, but how I move on from that and how I react to that, by extension, of course, I'm talking about the condition that we all face. This is a conversation about how we all react to this situation. It's up to us to decide how we respond when we're wronged against. I know they're responsible for the initial bad thing, but it's up to us as to how we shape our lives after that. And you won't be able to free yourself from limiting beliefs until you deal with that and process that idea. They'll always... being controlled by the wrongs other people have committed against you is a very powerful way that you can have your potential limited. Wrapping up, our beliefs are formed from limited experience of a much greater reality. Now, I just feel like I should just, in wrapping up, I shouldn't really go into detail with these points, but you might be thinking there is no greater reality. And what I would say to you is that the idea that you can comprehend all of what's there is ridiculous. So our ideas are formed from a limited experience of a much greater reality. Figuring things out is very difficult. And we work together far more effectively than when we're alone. We need each other. Dogma is not just for religion. It's a byproduct of the human condition. When people identify dogmas, when they realise that they're believing something that's rubbish, their faith in previously held beliefs can be challenged and seriously disrupted. And that will ripple out. It won't just stay on the belief that's been identified as rubbish. They will question things around them. We imprison ourselves in our limiting beliefs. And our freedom is our responsibility and no one else's. Whew, it's been a heavy one, this one. What I can tell you is that for the next lecture, it's going to be the most exciting and interesting one that I'll be doing. We'll be talking about exceptional conscious experiences. So, until then, thank you for your attention.
Most people think consciousness is supercalifragilisticexpialidocious.
We all have our own inner movie.
Consciousness is an amazing collection of sort of mundane tricks in the brain.
If nature is made of nothing but unconscious matter, how come we're conscious?
Consciousness is irreducibly subjective. Now that sense of being a subject, a locus of consciousness inside the head, is an illusion.